one guy in the room who did not have a cell phone within 6 inches of him. So that tells you something. The way that I met him will tell you another thing. And I was walking down the street with Megan, and we were down in the West Village, and I see these two people walking ahead of us with these really cool backpacks on, and I'm, kind of creepily come up with my camera behind them and start taking photographs, but I couldn't get a good shot, so I stopped them. I said, "Hey, where'd you get those bags?" And we started this conversation, and so, long story short, they both started telling me about their business and their experience in Eastern medicine and Western medicine and the integration of the two, and that they're starting a company, and Ray has been a disciple of two very, I would say, experienced and expert doctors in Eastern medicine, but also practitioners of Western medicine, licensed here in the States, working and living here in the States. And the stories were just so phenomenal that I was like, wow, you got to come to Lucid and you got to share it with this crowd, because I think that you'll all appreciate it. So before I ramble on any longer, I'd like to introduce Ray Lamb.
Thanks. How are you doing? It is true, I do not have a cell phone because my battery died. So I had to print everything out on paper. It's true. We met because of the bags, and we ended up talking about how they were made better, and that turned into a conversation about how things in the past were different than they are now. And to take this back, the medicine is very similar, but the difference is this. The Chinese have had 5,000 years to make their mistakes. And when they had wars, they would bring people in and capture all the prisoners, and they would experiment on them. So they had plenty of data, right? So over time, over thousands of years, they finally got it together, and they were able to codify a body of knowledge where they could say that, yes, this is true. If we did this, this would happen. If people from this region had this, that would happen. And they had some ridiculous pieces of information. I mean, they knew that the urine from a prepubescent boy would help somebody with a sore throat. Now think about that. That means that somebody had to try the post-pubescent boys and girls before they could figure out the prepubescent one. They knew that a certain herb, 5 or 10 of them, would kill a child. 50 of them would kill an adult. Where'd that information come from? Well, it's hard-earned. It's from battles and wars and thousands of years of experience. So anyway, so the clock rolls on, and the medicine gets mired in religion. So now you have a situation where if you go to the doctor, this is in ancient China, if you go to a doctor and you say, well, I've got this pain in my neck, and I went to sleep, and I woke up with it, and it's just been hurting, and it won't go away. So the doctor would say, well, you know what that is? Your mother's best friend's uncle died 2 years ago, and he's mad at you because you didn't do this, that, and the other thing. So you would be stuck. You're like, oh, man, this sucks. So what do? They're like, don't worry, I got to take care of it. Come over here, come to my house. We're going to buy this bolt of silk, which is what he always wanted to give his mom, and we'll buy some gold, and we'll do the ceremony. And at the end of it, he would pray over this bowl, and then you would have to drink it. And then miraculously, the pain in the neck would go away. Well, clearly that was the medicine, right? So as a consequence, by 1890, Chinese medicine was illegal in China. If you were in China, you were not allowed to practice Chinese medicine. Now this goes on, and it's illegal, and everybody still does it, but they have to do it on the ground now, because officially it's considered fraud. It's not until 1956 where Mao takes over China, and he looks and he goes, okay, well, we have 5 different regions of China, and this part is like a desert, and that's a jungle, and these are mountains. So different people have different ailments, and they didn't really have medical schools. They had a family. This region had a family that could cure diseases. That region had a family that could cure diseases. So Mao got all these families in a room, and he said, look, you know, I know you guys are all from different places, but you know what? There's got to be some kind of commonality. So put it all on paper, and we'll index it. We'll make it uniform, so that we can have a uniform Chinese medicine. And of course, I'll kill you and your family and everybody you know if you don't do it. So everybody complied. And they conducted this experiment from 1956 to 1976, where the Chinese had to pit their traditional medicines, which are acupuncture, herbology, reflexology, moxibustion, and I think that's about it, unless there's some obscure thing I haven't encountered. But they pit that against surgery, penicillin, aspirin, and Tylenol, and whatever else they had in 1950. And after 20 years, they brought their results forward. And what they had found was that, well, there were certain things that this methodology was more appropriate for. And then there was other things that this methodology was good for. And they didn't really cross over. And at that point, Mao said, well, you know what? We'll keep them both, and we'll keep them together, and we'll integrate them. And incidentally, that's right around when the first Chinese medical school was opened in London. So they were the first ones, and I think the Germans followed soon after. So that was in the 70s. So now fast forward to 2012, right? In the US, you have your allopathic surgery, medical-based physical therapy methodologies. And then you have the Chinese-based acupuncture, massage therapy, and herbology, and all split up. Like there's a license for acupuncture, but there's no license for herbs, and because they're considered vitamins. And there's no license for, well, actually, I think there is a license for massage in New York, but that doesn't apply to all 50 states. So it's all been broken apart. So now the question becomes, what do you do? Which way do you go, and why? And that is really what brought Christine and I to bringing this information together so that people can make a more informed decision. Because what you have now is really, it's a system of acute versus chronic, and what you should do when one situation happens as opposed to another. But you know, to illustrate that, I'll give you some stories from my experience and my journey through learning a lot of this stuff. Back in the early 90s, I was practicing martial arts, and I was a bit of a knucklehead about it. I was learning knife fighting from these Filipino guys, and they were like, okay, well, you take the knife, and you grab his hand, you do this to him, and the knife will come out, right? So I'm like, okay. But to myself, I didn't believe him, so I hid the knife. I was like, you know what, I'm not gonna let go of this knife. I don't care what he does. So I go and I stick the knife out, and he does his move, and he's like, ah. And all I hear is pop, 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 pop. And that was all the bones in my wrist. So I go to the teacher, I'm like, hey, so-and-so just did this move, and I heard 5 pops, and now I can't move my hand. And he's like, oh my God. So he grabs my wrist, and he goes, bah, 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 and he pops it back, which I think was probably worse. So now I couldn't move my hand. My hand only had about this much range of motion, right? And that was about it. And I couldn't really move it. And there was nobody who could do anything about it. I went to NYU Medical Center. They did their scans, they ran their blood tests, and they said, well, you know, it's been traumatized, it's been sprained. You know, we got some steroid cream, we got some cortisone, and this should go away in a little bit. So I waited. 2 years, it never went away. So I by chance, I had a friend who was riding his bicycle, and he had fallen in such a way that his collarbone had slammed into the neck of the bicycle and cracked his collarbone. So his father was actually a proctologist, so he brought him to the finest surgeons in the country, and they were going to insert a screw and do all this stuff. But he went to this Chinese doctor, and the Chinese doctor looked at it, and he said, no, we don't have to do that. And he just made a poultice, and he said his bones dropped down, right? They were hanging, and they would just lift them back up, and he would put the poultice on it, and he would wrap his arm up, and this would go on for weeks. It would drop down, he would lift it back up, and they would put a poultice on it. And after about 5 or 6 weeks, it stayed up. And he had to sleep a certain way, he had to sleep sitting up, I believe, and with a sling. So it healed without ever having any surgery. So then that guy says, well, you know, now that you've been injured for so long, I'll teach you some martial arts so you can build your strength back up. So he agreed to it, and he invited me to train with him. So I went down there, and the first thing this little old guy did was he wanted me to do this little practice with this little jar, and it really hurt my wrist because I had dislocated it, well, arguably twice, because I dislocated it and relocated it. So I tell him, I'm like, oh, when I grab that jar, it really hurts. And he's like, oh my God, you hurt yourself. I said, no. I explained to him what happened, and he said, oh, okay. So he points at my finger and he says, does it hurt over here? And I'm like, yeah, and bang, and he put a needle in it. He had hid an acupuncture needle underneath his finger, unbeknownst to me, okay? So that's my first exposure to acupuncture, right? So I've seen it on TV, and now it's sticking out of my hand. So I hang out there, and I'm like, what do I do now? And he's like, no, we watch TV. So we sat there and we watched this soap opera, and he explained to me, he was like, all right, well, that guy, he likes that girl, but they were actually brother and sister, but they were separated at birth like 20 years ago. They don't know. And this goes on for about half an hour. And he pulls the needle out, and he goes, okay, you try. You try the jar. And I'm like, okay. I grab the thing. I'm like, wow, it doesn't hurt it there anymore. But it hurts over here. Long story short, 5 needles later, I got my whole wrist back. That day. After 2 years of moving about this far. So he got my trust. I was like, oh wow, this guy really knows what he's doing. So I hang out with him, and I train with him, and I pay him. Right? So after a couple of years, I'm training, and he's got guys who are in their 60s. This guy's like in his 80s. He's got guys who are in their 60s, they've been with him for 30 years, and they're teaching me this move and that move and the other move. So this guy grabs my wrist, and he's like, oh yeah, you grab his wrist and you pull him. And he pulls my arm right out of the socket. Well, some of you guys might know that the shoulder blade has a bone in the front like a hook. And basically the tendons and the blood vessels run around that hook down your arm, right? So what happened was it came off the hook, and then when I went back, it went underneath the hook. So now I can only raise my arm about that high. So I go back there, and I'm like, so-and-so pulled my arm out of the socket, and I can raise my arm this high. And he's like, what? He's like, well, I was like, well, I have insurance. So I go to my doctor. I make an appointment at the Hospital for Joint Diseases on 17th Street and 2nd Avenue, and I get in there. And I have a surgeon that's referred to me from NYU Medical Center. And they get together and they look at my scans and they're like, yeah, that tendon's underneath that. We're gonna have to cut it. We're gonna have to cut it, we're gonna have to reattach it, we're gonna have to place a bolt through the side. We're gonna have to cut this tendon and then pull it over the top to keep that clavicle from moving around. And then later on you're gonna have to come back and then have that one put back under, and then you can take the bolt out. And the whole thing will take about 2 years. Right, so I go back to the Kung Fu teacher, and I'm like, I gotta have a bolt put in, and he's gonna cut this, and it's gonna suck. And he's like, takes my scans, and he's like, shut up. Smokes a cigarette, So he's like, oh, I see, it's right over here, yeah. Right about there, okay. He's like, this is gonna hurt. And he just grabs it, and he puts it back. I'm like, oh my God. Now my shoulder is purple and about twice the size at this point from him grabbing it and putting it back. But I can move, see? I can move the whole thing, right? So now it becomes a weather predictor. When it's cold out, it hurts. When it's gonna rain, I'll know 12 hours before you will because it's pulsing, right? So I go to my doctor, I go back to the doctor at NYU, and I said, well, this thing hurts when when it rains in the morning, when it's cold. And he says, yeah, you have arthritis. And I'm like, okay, well, what do we do about it? And he says, okay, well, I've got what's called a cortisone shot, right? But you can only take that once every 45 days because what it does is it dissolves the nerve so you don't feel the pain. But you have to give it 15 days to grow back. So what do I do during those 15 days? He's like, well, we've got Celebrex, which is basically just Vioxx with some other drug, right? A muscle relaxer. So I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, okay, well, I could do that. So I asked the doctor, I'm like, well, how long do we have to do this for? And he goes, well, from now on. I'm like, wait, what do you mean from now on? He was like, yeah, that's all we've got. That's what you got to do. I was like, dude, I'm 22. From now on's a long time. So I go back to the doctor. I go back to the Kung Fu guy. And I'm like, I went to see a doctor. He said, arthritis, I have to do this thing. There's cortisone shot. And he said, shut up. I said, come here. And he's looking at it, and he sticks a couple of needles in it, and he's like, all right. and he puts together this pile of herbs, which smell pretty good. It smells very nice. Boy, was I wrong. This stuff smells horrible when you cook it. And on top of it, it cleans you out. So every time you drink it, you smell it more. Every single time. I took 60 of these in a row. Towards the end, I heard you laughing. Towards the end, if I smelled anybody cooking this stuff from across the room, I would hurl. Because it was just that bad. I mean, you could hold your nose. I mean, there was nothing you could do. It was just horrible. But it worked. And the arthritis went away. And I had my full range of motion. And I didn't have to have surgery. And I went back to my doctor, and I showed him. I said, look, I don't have that anymore, and I can move, and I didn't need to have any surgery. And I thought he would be happy. I thought as a doctor he would say, well, that's great. Let's figure out how to do this, because there's other people who will need this. But instead he said, okay, I see that. Please leave. And I said, really? He's like, yeah. And he was like, and don't talk to any of my patients. You got to go. So that was when I realized, I was like, okay, this is a racket. This is just their way of making money, or at least this particular group of people. You know? So I continued on with the doctor, with the Chinese Kung Fu doctor. And over the years, I became sort of his assistant. But it wasn't a nice relationship. It was more like, it's like, come here. I got to pop this guy's hip back in place. I need you to stand on him. You know, stuff like that. And then later on, there was another patient. She had a car accident, and she had a herniated disc. And apparently, the disc was just off ever so slightly. It was just sitting on the nerve, so it was just kind of twanging that pain. And she was on a steady dose of pills, and she was just turning gray. So he was like, oh, I got to straighten this thing out. So he broke the ribs on either side, grabbed it, and then straightened it out, and then put herbs. He used that same poultice that he used for the guy's clavicle, broken clavicle, and he healed her ribs so that she wouldn't be a permanent buyer of pain medicine. Let's see. And then years later, I had another friend whom I had convinced to train with me. And we were working out, and apparently as you train more and more, your blood circulation improves to the point where it kind of bumps up against all your injuries. So then they become acute. And this guy, we were in college. We were in our late teens, early 20s, and we were hanging out, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he started to talk slower and slower, and then he couldn't really move, and then he told me he was about to pass out. And so I called the doctor, and I said, what had happened? He said, oh, well, I'm still here, so quick, come down. We'll take a look at it. So he threw him on the table, he checked him out, and he put a suction cup right at the base of his spine. And he grabbed me, and he pulled me to the side, and he was like, Ray, you can't kick people like that. You can kill them. And I'm like, I didn't kill him. I didn't kick him. He was like, don't lie to me. You kicked him so hard, you damn near killed him. And I was like, I did not kick him. After about 5 minutes, he was looking at the suction cup, and he looked at it, and there was a spot that appeared, and it had black leopard stripes on it. And so he looked at it, he goes, oh no, you didn't kick him. In fact, that's about 10 years old. So he said, well, ask this guy, did something happen 10 years ago? So we asked him, and he said, yes. In junior high school, he was in the lunchroom, and he slipped and fell right on the small of his back, and he was incapacitated for 3 days. He couldn't walk. And then it seemingly went away. But no, actually what it did was it stayed in his body, and it just stayed dormant until recently when he had worked out and his blood circulation improved, and it banged up against it, and that's what caused it to overflow and cause that disease. So what we found was that after looking at all of this information, he's a vascular surgeon. He does heart surgeries. But he was also an acupuncturist and Chinese doctor, and he always advocated doing one thing because it was right, not because it was what he did. He always said, when you deal with people's ailments, it's just a lock and key situation. It's like you have a lock, you have a key, and you just need that key to open that lock. It doesn't have to be the world's biggest key. It doesn't have to have diamonds on it. It doesn't have to be the most expensive key. It just has to work. And that's what brought us to thinking about what it is that health is really all about. And what we boiled it down to, it's circulation, it's the ability to assimilate your food, the ability to rest, your ability to breathe, and your ability to go to the bathroom. And this is basically what Edgar Casey said, this old American homeopath. So based on that, we've figured out that, you know, everybody, no matter what, if you value your health, you're gonna have to put in some work. And you're gonna have to pay very good attention to your nutrition and your exercise and the types of therapies that you need that are specific to your ailments. And if you do that, then you can avoid entering this medical paradigm that seeks to just squeeze every dollar out of you simply because you have an ailment. You know. But anyway, I think my time's up.
All right, so start the line over here afterwards because I know that everyone wants some help.
Sorry, so you were talking before about sometimes Western versus Eastern medicine. How do you, as a patient, decide, well, whatever, this element is best treated with Eastern medicine, but that element is best treated with Western medicine? How do you, because unless you have a practitioner that practices both so they have no bias, how do you, as a patient, figure out what's the best approach?
That's a very good question. The best way of handling that is to use whichever method has their technique perfected. So in any given case, I would always go for the Western medicine as it pertains to scans, blood work, or any type of measuring that they can do, because it doesn't interfere with your body. Well, at least, you know, choose the ones that don't, because some do. And then based on that information, you can then reevaluate what would be necessary.
But that still gets the question of, okay, like whatever the X-ray shows, it can show a torn ligament versus a broken bone, or how do I, as a patient, make a decision about I should go to an Eastern doctor practice Eastern medicine versus a doctor practice Western medicine? You know, the scan is to come up with a diagnosis, but ultimately there's two different paths to go for treatment, and unless you have a rare practitioner who practices both, how is you as a layman and a patient able to decide? Because if you go to the Western practitioner, he's going to tell you he has the only way to treat it, and I'm sure to the Eastern practitioner, you say, oh, I've got the only way to treat it, when one might be wrong and one might be right. So how do you, based on the diagnosis, decide which way to go?
Well, that's why we were starting a company, because we're going to give this education out so that you can decide. Because in both Eastern and Western practitioners, not all of them are good at many things, and very few of them are even good at one thing. So it's not just the East versus West thing. It's a well, can this person do that, or can this person do this? And you have to find them.
Eastern, Western, Western,
Yeah, something like
Right.
that. Yeah,
The short answer is you go to Ray.
exactly.
Joe, here comes a doctor question.
I'm a Western physician, but my question is, in your company and your way to evaluate Eastern versus Western, do you believe in the randomized control trial? In other words, a scientific approach to take a group of patients who all have the same disease, randomize them into one group who believes they're getting the treatment but isn't, and the other group that is getting the treatment, and then measuring the actual outcomes and seeing if there's any difference between the two different groups. Do you believe in that?
Absolutely. In fact, that
Just
was done
repeat
actually extensively.
the question.
Oh,
The
the
scientific
question-
method, basically.
Yeah, the question was whether or not I believed in randomized group studies, where you get a group of patients and then you give one group a treatment and you give the other a placebo, and see if there's actually a difference after the treatment has been administered. And I completely do. And this has actually been done extensively in every country in the world except this one.
I think
This has been done in many countries except this one since the 70s. Yes.
Okay, wait. We can have a debate afterwards. However, but I think just because we're short of time, I think that we could take this conversation offline. And but thank you very much, Ray. Terrific.